Society and Inference seminar at UC Berkeley. We're pleased to have Victoria Stoughton here from Columbia University, the statistics department. She's been visiting and teaching in our statistics department this semester. Victoria's research concerns data reproducibility, research reproducibility, and data science. And we're very pleased to have her today. Please welcome Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you. So what I'd like to do for this talk is hopefully treat it more like a discussion. So I wanted to say that if I'm going to try and say some things that are thought-provoking that you might question, and so if you want to sort of jump in with comments and so on, please feel free. The other thing to mention in housekeeping is I put my slides on the web, so if you're here with your own laptop or tablet, feel free to just pull them up and you can follow along at your own pace. Okay, when should we trust the results of data science? So I think this is hopefully an interesting question to you as much as it is to me. I also am going to try and convince you today that this is the core question that we should be asking about data science. It's not something that's just great if it happens. It's actually one of the reasons that we're actually doing data science. It's the science part of data science. And I'm also going to try and convince you today that this isn't something that is automatic based on our tradition in science, that there's actually a number of problems that are unique as data science and big data start to really impact the nature of the research we do and the types of results that we see and the type of conclusions that we're drawing, not just in academia and the ivory tower, but decision making across society. So I'm going to try and highlight some of those today. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how one of the things to think about is how to update our research paradigms, or whether they even need to be updated in the context of big data and data science. Creating reliable computational science. So what exactly does that mean, and why is it important, and why is that something that's this new issue on our plate now? What does it mean to be doing statistical inference in big data settings? So statistics is an old field, and there's an enormous amount of work that's been done. Why do we need to kind of revisit this? Isn't this something, we can use traditional methods from smaller science or other types of analysis that we're all familiar with. Why do I have to think about something new? I'm going to try and convince you that that's also important. So based on this, if you agree that reliability is something that's important in our inference from big data and computational science, and I can maybe get you at least thinking about some of the ways that we do that inference across big data, then the next thing to do is think about what inference and scientific knowledge production means in the context of data science, in the context of ubiquity of data and big data, and how do we actually start formulating that into actionable paradigms that we can actually use when we're doing the research and also use when we're trying to understand and interpret the results of the research. I'll also talk about some efforts to address some of the issues that I'm going to point to. I'm certainly not the only one pointing to these issues, and there's some really wonderful attempts to sort of attack different pieces of the problem. The reason I think when can we trust the results of data science is appropriate for our talk, because it actually it encompasses a large number of issues that I think it may require more than a talk to even kind of go over. So people are chipping away at little pieces of this, and in really wonderful ways. Okay, so the first one, updating our research paradigms, thinking about creating reliable inference from computational science. Okay, so this goes back to the 1660s, where we had our first standards about reliability and also about reproducibility in science, not in computational science. That picture is Robert Boyle, and he's a huge figure in science, and especially in chemistry. He also has impacted everything that we do as scientists and researchers, because he was the one who really formalized this idea of reproducibility back in the 1660s. And this was also the time when the first journal was being created. People before that, scientists were sort of passing letters around, and they decided to formalize this into transactions of the Royal Society. And when this was happening, one of the things that he said is, let's also have communication standards there that would allow others who are educated in the field or competent in the field to go ahead and replicate the experiments that they're sort of reporting on when they're publishing in transactions. So that was our first exposure to the idea of reproducibility, that science isn't about communicating the results that you got, the answers. It's about communicating not just what you got, but really it's about the how, the actual knowledge that led you to those conclusions. That's actually the primary thing that we're communicating as scientists. And so that was Boyle that brought that into the scientific method, and it's just been there the whole time. Reproducibility, everyone in here would know it and recognize it as something important in scientific research. So this brings in notions of transparency, how we actually transfer, communicate knowledge that we've gleaned through doing our work. The ideas were perfecting the scholarly record. So thinking about getting this as correct as we can. Of course, we all know as scientists we're never getting anything perfect. What we're doing is we're putting out our best guess, as it were, and then having a continuing ongoing discussion. So we're trying to improve this scholarly record. Around a lot of these issues, I think people sort of get distracted into things like, oh, well, it's about reuse of the data, or it's about these other things. Really, it's just about getting the scholarly record right. This will come up again as I go through the talk. Okay, I don't need to tell you, but technology has changed the nature of experimentation, data, communication. It's impacted all of this. So I'll give you a couple of ways. I think there's 3 different ways that technology is having very deep and important and lasting impacts on the way we conduct science. So the first one, I don't need to tell people in this room this one, but we've got enormous and increasing amounts of data collection. I just pulled a few examples here. So the first one, one of the 5 projects at the Large Hadron Collider, the CMS project, pulling off 780 terabytes a year when the collider's running. Post-processing brings that up to petabytes that these researchers are operating with. I've used that stat for a couple of years now, and recently someone in a talk told me it's hopelessly out of date and this is much too small. They're actually dealing with much larger amounts of data. Sloan Digital Sky Survey, 60 terabytes of data. If you want to sort of take a look at images that are coming from our telescopes and mapping the sky, it seems a lot less than what folks in Switzerland have to deal with. But that's not something that is manageable, right? Anyone with a laptop here, you need some kind of specialized way of interacting with that data. You're not going to just put 60 terabytes on your laptop and open an Excel spreadsheet or something. It really requires a whole different set of tools and a different way of thinking about the data. Laser in 2009 published with co-authors about the quantitative revolution in social science, so much social network data that sociology, political sciences are being reoriented into quantitative fields now and less qualitative than they used to be. And I'll skip the last one about the survey, but lots of researchers are working with really big data sets. Okay, so big data, people are sort of familiar with this. The second big change that's happening is we have extremely powerful machines now. So it's not just a case of your laptop being more powerful, which it is, allowing you to do a lot more in a local setting. It's also supercomputing, very fast, high-performance computing machines that allow us to do things in science that we've never done up until maybe about 20 years ago. We can map a physical system, simulate this, see what happens, change the parameters, rerun this system, see what the impact of those parameter changes actually are, and start to learn about these physical systems this way. That's a brand new way of trying to understand our world. Okay, so probably you've thought about both of those two or been exposed to them. The third one, which I think is just as important, is as we move towards bigger data, bigger computation, more ubiquitous computing across research, deep intellectual contributions, bona fide scientific contributions are now embedded in software, and sometimes I like to say, and only in software. So one of the themes of my talk is that what we report in scientific publications and articles now is missing pieces of information. And I'll flesh that comment out as I go through the talk. But one of them is, without access to the software, we don't capture all the intellectual contributions that have been made that are important for understanding those results. Any others that I missed? Okay, so when I first started thinking about this topic, I was curious as to how computation was actually impacting research. Is it actually as ubiquitous as what it appears to me? And if it is impacting, well, what's kind of going with it in terms of sharing standards? So I looked at the Journal of the American Statistics Association, Journal of the American Statistical Association, went back to 1996. I looked at all these issues in June. And we started in 1996, about half the articles are computational. By about 2009, they're all computational, and we've just kind of flatlined. Everything has a computational component in there. Even sort of proof-oriented or mathematical articles have some demonstration or some computational implementation in them. In 2011, we were up to 21% seemed to have some recognition that accessing the code is important. They would sort of tell me where it was or indicate what packages they had used or something like this. So that means 4 to 5 of these articles, at least in JASA, are reporting these results where you don't have a way to dig in and see what happened, let alone giving the contributions that are happening in software. In 2011, John Ioannidis published a paper. He looked at the medical community. So I don't think JASA was actually included in there. And there are standards in a lot of publishing and bioinformatics about sharing data and so on. And he tried to get the raw primary data from these studies. He ended up with 9% being able to actually get the data for these studies. And if you think about, what I was talking about with Boyle and with reproducibility, you start to see that maybe there's a little bit of thinking that we have to do as a community. So without data, without code, generally speaking, you have not enough information in the publication to understand what was done, how those results were generated, how sensitive are those results. If I change the data a little bit, how do the results change? All these questions that you might have, you can't really test out, let alone if they even code it right? All these kind of basic questions. So people have called this a credibility crisis in computational science, and I think that's the right word. Okay, so there's a number of different perspectives you can take on code data availability and inference in big data. I think the most scientific one that I know is by Stanford Emeritus Professor now, John Claerbout, describing really reproducible research. So he is from geophysics and has been practicing his version of really reproducible research since the early 90s. My thesis advisor, David Donahoe, paraphrased his approach by saying, the idea of really reproducible research is that an article about computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship, it's merely advertising of the scholarship. The actual scholarship is the complete set of instructions and data that generated the figures. So that, in a way, it harks back to Boyle, right? With this idea that the emphasis isn't on the solution, the emphasis is on what process did you take to get there. That's the real knowledge, and those are the learnings from what you've done. We don't have access to code and data, and this isn't described in the paper the way it used to be. Okay, so if we think about our frame for this, the scientific method that guides much of the way we approach research and answer questions and contribute to our stock of scientific knowledge, traditionally we have 2 branches. First branch of the scientific method, mathematics, formal logic, are deductive reasoning. Second branch, inductive reasoning, so statistical analysis of controlled experiments, doing empirical observational research. There's a lot of talk, I'm sure everybody in this room has heard it, about now we've got this new branch of the scientific method, the third branch, from very fast machines and lots of computing power. We've got a fourth branch with data-driven computational science, and all this technology is kind of upending the way that we think about science and the way that we do scientific investigation. Here's a couple of examples of this. I took this, I just sort of poked around on the web. There's nothing particularly special about this. So this is a web page from 1995. There was a NIST workshop. And the words are here, but I pulled them out, so it's going to be impossible for you to read. But in 1995, these folks are saying, it is common now to consider computation as a third branch of science, besides theory and experiment. Over here, this is an edited book produced, I think, in 2009, in part by Microsoft and other folks, and they have lots of contributors. And right in the preface, the book is called The Fourth Paradigm, so you sort of know where I'm going with this. Right in the preface, they say the book is about a new fourth paradigm for science based on data-intensive computing. So probably there seems to be a little blurring between these two right? One has definitely got a computational aspect. These are focused on computation. But regardless, people are making these assumptions that these are, new branches of the scientific method, and it's a fait accompli. Okay, so then we end up with some of these articles that have come up over the last, these are all from the last year. Probably most of you saw the October issue from last year of The Economist, How Science Goes Wrong. LA Times is saying science has lost its way at a big cost to humanity. And Science, Nature are running these articles around reproducibility. This one called Reproducibility in Science from January. Announcement, reducing our irreproducibility, and Nature is telling us we must try harder at what we're doing. NIH is also tackling reproducibility. And so I started thinking about, well, given what we know about Boyle, about sort of traditional notions of reproducibility, and given what I just explained about changes coming from the enormous amounts of data we have now and the enormous amounts of computing power and ever growing, these changes in technology, so how does this map to what is happening with all these sort of this discussion over the last year with reproducibility? I imagine everybody's kind of seen some stuff around this. And I think this parses out into at least three different ways of thinking about reproducibility. So the first one I called empirical reproducibility. So this is, I just put a little snapshot of the Nature article, announcement reducing our irreproducibility. This is Boyle's version of reproducibility. And you can see it also in their title, Must Try Harder. So we need to just do a better job reporting the way Boyle wanted us to, and then we'll be able to get around this reproducibility crisis happening. So it doesn't have anything to do really with code data. They're just saying, let's get our reporting standards up. The second one I call computational reproducibility. Now this really is around code data. This is fundamentally a new thing that Boyle obviously wasn't talking about code and data disclosure. Boyle was talking about writing things up in your paper. So computational reproducibility, there was, this is from ICERM News. There were a few others with some workshop co-organizers. I put together a little piece talking about a workshop report we did a couple of years ago, setting the default to reproducible in computational science research. So the idea is things are open and reproducible just as a sort of standard practice. Okay, so that's not enough. All of you are probably thinking, well, that's great. If I have someone's code and data, maybe I can get their results, but that doesn't tell me that they're right or of any value. I mean, yeah, I can see the steps that they took, so now at least we have a basis for conversation, and at least I can compare results, but I'd really like to start knowing when I can believe those results, even if I'm able to replicate them on the machine. So empirical reproducibility has a little bit to say about that. Statistical reproducibility has a lot to say about that, and I'll talk more about this. So this is also that piece from Science on reproducibility from January, where what Science magazine is doing is putting in new standards around the statistics that were carried out for publications in science, and I'll talk more about that coming up. So I feel like there's sort of three spheres of attention around this reproducibility issue, and maybe you guys can think of a little more. Okay, so this is the workshop where we had the workshop report. It was called Reproducibility in Computational and Experimental Mathematics. It's from the end of 2012, and what we tried to do was bring together not just computational researchers from a variety of different fields, like mathematics, statistics, computer science, earth sciences, whatever, biology, bioinformatics. Also, we had stakeholders there, like folks from funding agencies who deal especially with data science and areas where there's a lot of technological change and advancement, and journal editors, and different stakeholders in the research community. And so we have, this is the actual report that I mentioned, so setting the default to reproducible, and we have a couple of little write-ups on this. So what we're trying to do in this report is really dive into the computational aspects of what it means to do reproducible computational science. If you think about work that you've done that's computational, and I tell you, okay, make your code and data available, listening to the first part of the talk, you might think, okay, this is a great idea. But then when it actually gets down to it, what aspects of the code do you make available, and what type of documentation do you have, and what are the standards, what platforms is it expected to run, and who uses this, and where should I put it? And then the data, so what version of it? Do I give you the raw data and then scripts that I've used to analyze this and to get it ready for analysis, or do I just give you the analysis scripts in that data set, or everything, or process data? So there's these sort of open questions, and I think that these are some of the questions that underlie why we're sort of stepping slowly towards being able to do reproducible computational science. So what we're trying to do here for the computational side is really try to answer those questions. What's appropriate reporting standards? What information do you need to include? Most everything is good enough with code and data, just getting everything out there. Okay, so let's go back to the scientific method. This was part of what we discussed at the workshop. So the scientific method came about because we're trying to get things right, and everything we do is so full of error, right? We're error prone, and if you think about work that you've done, it's so easy to, do something a little bit differently in the data set, or not save a step, or have a parameter set slightly wrong, or anything computational is highly complex. There's a lot of moving parts, and it could be parts of code that you're using that are functions that are written by other people, and they have embedded errors and you don't even realize. So there's this sort of big struggle against error that we're all engaging in all the time as researchers. And part of what we're doing when we publish or present results is we're trying to convince the other people that really I've done everything I can to get error out of this process. I'm trying to convince you that the results are the most credible that we've got at the moment. Okay, so this thinking is embedded in our two traditional branches. In the deductive branch, you publish your mathematical result, but you publish it with a proof. You don't just sort of tell people that there's a result out there and have fun. And maybe Fermat's last theorem is the exception. But you're always, and everyone knows what these standards for a proof are. In the empirical branch, there's a way you set up your experiments. You have a notion of hypothesis testing, and you test the hypothesis. At least this is the theory. You use appropriate statistical methods, and then when you publish, you can see in the templates that journals give you to write up your results, you have a methods section, and you're supposed to write out what you did, and the idea behind that is reproducibility. So in a sense, that's like a notion of a proof in mathematics, sort of saying what steps and what reasoning got you to those final results. So here's my claim. Computation presents only a potential third or fourth branch of the scientific method until we develop these comparable standards. So I think I don't mean to pick on NIST or that book or whatnot, this conversation's everywhere, but I think it's premature. I think we need to step back and think about how can we elevate work that happens in the computational sphere, data-driven work, really to become a branch of the scientific method as with the deductive or empirical branch. We're not there yet. So I'm going to spend a chunk of time now talking about barriers and steps that I think we can take to begin to elevate this type of research to bona fide branches of the scientific method. Okay, data and software. I've noticed in policy discussions that people talk about data, and there's a discussion around access to data, and maybe there's a discussion around software, but usually there isn't, and if there is, it often happens in sort of a separate conversation to software. So this slide is to try and convince you that they're both sides of the same coin, and they need to be always kind of considered as part of the same package in the context of research. Okay, digital databases. If you have data on a system, you've got software. It's embedded in a software system. There's no other way to access the data. There's no other way to store the data. So already you've got this intrinsic connection between data and software. You just can't have data on its own unless you print it out on paper. But in the computational setting, we've always got software associated with this data. Filtering, analysis, visualization, storage, all of these things you might not consider necessarily part of your scientific research, but all of this software is associated with your data. Computation obviously requires software. We're executing jobs on these machines. And the investigation either produces data, generally speaking, so simulations may have data as an output, or it uses data as an input, like much of data science. So even when you think about something that's more kind of along the lines I've been calling the third branch, data is woven intrinsically into this as well. So I think data and software should be considered together as different but inextricably linked components of the computational science research process. Now, as I go on, I'll see, like, for example, I'll talk a little bit about legal barriers, and there's different ways legally you need to consider data and software. But from a scientific perspective, they're both important parts of what we need to be thinking about as our scientific outputs from doing data science and computational science. Okay, so some of the intellectual property barriers. One of the only exceptions to thinking about data and software in separate spheres. I see at least two barriers to access to data and access to software. One of them is copyright. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slides, but software is subject to copyright. Data can be subject to copyright. It's a little bit of a blurry area that I'll talk about. Software can also be subject to patents as well. So if you think about sort of freely available software, like for example, the scripts that generated your results, you need to think through copyright issues, you need to think through potential patenting issues in order to share this and make it available with your results. Okay, I think I have a slide coming up on Bayh-Dole as well. Okay, so the first one for copyright, I came up with what I think are some solutions to address copyright issues in sharing of data and sharing of code. I called it the Reproducible Research Standard. So we'll talk about that first. So copyright, I'm going to convince you that hopefully convince you that this is something that is exactly opposite to what we would like to do with our scientific knowledge and scientific outputs. And yet this is something that is absolutely without question here to stay. This is just going to be something part of how we do research and how we share our research. It comes from the Constitution, and I like putting this up here because it's, when you first see it, you kind of think, well, maybe this is actually something that's useful to us. Okay, so in the Constitution it says that copyright is to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So they're talking about the progress of science. Whenever, in modern times when we talk about copyright, people start thinking about, movie agents, movie folks and Hollywood and, recording artists and so on, Mickey Mouse. Really, it was about progress of science and useful arts. So what this means is the way that copyright has evolved as it's been enshrined in law, case law, and also law from Congress, any original expression of an idea is going to fall under copyright by default. So this includes your software. It also includes your figures, your text, and so on. So you're even just writing, like typing some R scripts or something on your machine, copyright is following your keystrokes across. So that's copyright to you. It's not something you have to register, and it's not something that you have any option about. That's just, it's on your work. What it means is that you are the only one who can legally reproduce the work. You're the only one who can prepare derivative works based on the original. Both of those things, I would love it if you went and reproduced some of my work. And if you wanted to write a paper based on my ideas, which is this derivative works based on the original, of course I would love that with citation, right? These are things that are really important in science, and yet copyright puts by default this barrier on sharing the software to allow this to happen. I won't go into it, but there are some exceptions and limitations like fair use that allow you to use copyrighted objects in certain contexts. It doesn't reach out to everything we'd like to do in science. Okay, so I wasn't the only one to notice that copyright is a barrier to sharing sometimes when people would like to share, but particularly for software. So this is Richard Stallman. He came up with the GNU public license, and he was the first one to realize that instead of having to ask someone for permission, so putting software out there under copyright, I would need to sort of get your permission in order to be able to do that stuff like reproduce your work and prepare derivative works based on your work. So Stallman said, well, why don't we just attach like a permission slip to the software itself, and it will just say, like, as a user, you can do all this stuff with it. Here are the terms of use. You don't even need to bother the person. So that's the fundamental insight of open source licensing. And with GNU Public License, he went and did that, and this is widely credited as one of the reasons that the open source software community was able to flourish. They set terms of use that allowed them to share their work as a community rather than having this used, say, or exploited or taken over by others. They were able to protect their work. Okay, so since then, there's tons and tons and tons of software licenses out there. So this is a picture of Larry Lessig, and he was inspired by Stallman and said, well, okay, Richard, that's great for software, but now there's other things that people want to share on the web. They'd like to share images. They'd like to share movies or clips or sound. And in fact, there's a lot of artists who want to share their artistic works. And these licenses around software just don't speak to those types of digital objects. So this was the idea behind Creative Commons. So Lessig, with two others, founded Creative Commons and came up with a suite of licenses for these digital artistic works that are not software. Like the Creative Commons licenses aren't appropriate for code, but it's okay. There's tons of open source licenses for software. So my idea was, well, let's think through what we need for sharing in the scientific context. So starting with these principles that I just talked about in the scientific method, if we're trying to access code, access data, and respect scientific norms that have been around hundreds of years, what type of licensing structure should we have on our work? We need something. Otherwise, we're in the no reproduce, no reuse world. So that was the idea behind the reproducible research standards. So get the parts of your research out under the license that is appropriate for that particular medium and also fits our norms. Our norms in science basically are sharing whatever we have, but I want citation, right? I want attribution, but basically we throw things out there for anybody to use. We just want to be cited for it. So what this means in terms of licensing is get your media components, like your text, figures, and so on, out under a Creative Commons attribution license. Code components under code-oriented attribution license, like modified BSD, MIT license, Apache 2.0. There's a couple of them that I point out. And then put your data into the public domain or attach an attribution license. I mentioned data has some complications with copyright. I'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide. Okay, so using these ideas around licensing removes the barrier that copyright by default places to sharing software for scientists and for reproducibility, and also fits with our norms as a community. So I think copyright can make some sense in protecting, say, an artist or a poet or something from having their work stolen by others. But for us, what we're doing at the point of publication, we're making things public with the goal that it gets used. And especially with software, just copy it and plagiarize it and use it. Okay, data. So there's no copyright on raw facts in the US. In Europe and in other places, there is copyright on facts. So you can see this is already a complicated issue because different jurisdictions treat copyright differently when it comes to data. There was a Supreme Court case in 1991 that decided that raw facts are not copyrightable. What happened is someone took, one company took a phone book and restructured all the names and addresses and so on in it and made a better phone book that started outselling the original. And they were sued by copyright, and the Supreme Court eventually said those raw facts, like your name, address, phone number, and so on, are not subject to copyright, but any original selection and arrangement that you've done to those raw facts is. So what does that mean for a scientist? It's our controlling law, by the way, on data. What's a raw fact in data? So there's no case law on how this actually applies to science. So one of the reasons I say put data in public domain when you can is because it just sidesteps this whole issue and says there's not going to be copyright on it. If you think you can argue original selection and arrangement, then I think you could put the appropriate license, a code license or Creative Commons license, on your description of your original selection and arrangement. Okay. Okay, so I'll mention the Bayh-Dole Act quickly as just the sort of the final mention around intellectual property. So code, as I mentioned, is subject to copyright as a barrier to sharing. It's also subject to patents. So patents doesn't produce the same barrier because it's not a default. You actually have to go and seek a patent on your code, or someone has to go seek a patent, whereas copyright is a default. But with patents, especially within university research, we're controlled by Bayh-Dole Act. This was passed, you can see right away, 1980. I can almost guarantee you that people in Congress who are writing this were not thinking about software or computation or anything that data science or anything like this. But what they were thinking about is they believed there were a lot of very useful inventions locked up in academia that weren't sort of getting out for people to use. So how could we provide incentives for these to be made available in a usable form? They gave ownership rights to institutions and encouraged them to use the patent system to get this stuff out there. So this was actually about transparency and about putting the ideas out there. But what's happening now with software is you can think that if we share code in a reproducible way, seeking a patent and going through the process of licensing can actually create a barrier to accessing this software. Okay. Okay, so let's go back to, oh, this is just a little bit more on Bayh-Dole. Okay, so let's go back to those original slides about the credibility crisis and how we deal with reproducibility. So I think that we can learn from the experience in observational science how to start addressing these issues in reproducibility in computational science, and also in terms of what folks have been doing and thinking about in simulations. Okay, so that brings us to section 2. So now that we think about maybe data code being an important part of reproducibility, as I said at the beginning, it doesn't guarantee that the results are correct. There really is no guarantee, but this is really just being able to even replicate and understand the findings. So what about statistical inference in big data? Are there places where traditional methods might break, even if we could reproduce them computationally, or other places that we need to think about this? So when people do independent replications, we actually end up with reliable knowledge. Okay. Sources of error is something statisticians have been dealing with and other people working with in inference for a very long time. So we are very cognizant of things like sampling errors, selection bias. Did you choose the right model? Did you choose the right functional form for your model? Have you omitted variables? These all apply in the big data setting. So arguably some of them, maybe you could say, well, it's less likely I've omitted variables if I'm sort of grabbing so much more data and I have so many more observations, I should be able to maybe have less selection bias. So I think these are just as important in big data settings as they are in any other statistical research setting. And I think in big data, there's new things that are popping up that, that are worth thinking about. Okay, let me just... Well, one thing I'll say here is that there's new information that needs to be recorded. For example, what are your parameter inputs when you're doing computational science? So thinking about extra pieces that need to travel with your, that could be considered data that need to travel with your findings and your results. Okay. Okay, so one of the main issues is it's fine if I can talk about, say, scripts or smaller data sets, and I talk about sharing, and maybe you can go and grab them and so on. But for example, that Sloan Digital Sky survey, it's 60 terabytes. How do you think about reproducibility in that setting if you were doing statistical analysis, for example? It's not something you just sort of throw out on the web. So reproducibility at scale is something that is an open question at this point. So if you have extremely large data sets, how easily can you replicate those data sets? How easily can you replicate the computation? So I could share my code. You could theoretically have access to a very big data set, and then running these scripts takes a very long time, or it takes specialized hardware that you need to access, and it's non-trivial to actually go and even check the results. Okay, so all these questions start to come up, like maybe some of the results should be shared in a pre-computed state, and how do you sort of make it easier to assess these results when you're working with very large data or very large computational systems? I don't have answers on that, but I throw the question out there. There is a workshop coming up in July in Atlanta, so to try and address these issues, like how do you deal with reproducibility? There's, you can see here, this is Exceed, which is just really quickly an NSF-funded project that's supposed to provide middleware allowing people to access very fast machines, even though they may not be a specialist at running jobs on those machines. And so all of this is really, well, how do we use that middleware layer to help do reproducible research? What do we need to capture? Or what kind of tools can we offer folks to make this easier? And it's a wide open question, even what a use case would look like in that setting. So far hasn't been hammered out. So I'll have to report back to you after the summer. Okay, so stability and robustness of results. So this is also work that is starting to rethink what are our expectations in terms of data science when we have very large data sets and massive amounts of computation. So one of the things that that comes to mind when you start doing replication, suppose you have independent replications on large data, you would hope that different results that have come from these different replications would be close in some sense. And so the idea is if they're close, you can say they're stable. So this is new work from Bin Yu in the statistics department here. And this idea of stability in statistical findings and statistical estimation is a new one. And if you think about sources of instability, you can have perturbations in the data. Like so, for example, you may be analyzing Twitter streams of data, and at some point you stop your analysis and stop your data collection and go ahead and do the analysis, and then a year later I take all the updated data and redo the analysis. You would hope that those results were stable for a reliable finding from data science. It's not at all clear they're going to necessarily be stable. I mean, things change as time goes on and so on. So perturbations in the data can, and sort of controlling and understanding how your data set may have changed can impact the stability of these results. And robustness, so what methods are you using? Probably, I would imagine most people in here have experience with methods like linear regression, where small changes in the data can really change your model and its interpretation. So understanding closeness that's sourced in perturbations in the data versus changes in the model, I think is something that's very important to understanding and interpreting results that have come from big data. Okay, so some of the things that I've been thinking about, and others have been thinking about, that are arising as we analyze very large data sets. So it seems like some elements of the sort of the generating p-values and using that as a benchmark for whether or not you've got a finding, which is entrenched in some areas of research, seems to break. Everything is significant. Every hypothesis test you run on these big data sets comes up with a really low p-value if you've got enough data. So how do you control for this? And how do you control for running lots of tests on your data set? Suppose there's one data set and many different researchers are using it for analysis. How do you pull out what are false positives? Or how do you know you've really got true findings? Or you're pulling out the signal from the noise. Have you constructed a experiment where you expect to be able to separate signal from noise? Or do you have enough power in your calculations? And an example I was going to talk about, I think on the next page, is there was a recent article, I think a month ago in Science, on how Google Flu Trends was breaking and starting to not give us as coherent results, even though it hasn't changed, I don't think, in any significant way. So do we even have, you can't assume that we've got enough power in our experiment just because we've got a lot of data. It goes back to all these issues in selection bias and measurement, the traditional statistical issues. So statisticians' view, a lot more data, we should have more reliable results. This is a good thing. We can contrast this with a computational view. A lot of data, well, now we've got to bring in notions of scalability as we implement algorithms across large data or specialized hardware or data set design, and it becomes this sort of scale becomes a challenge in computational science. So how do you traverse large data sets effectively to carry out algorithms consistently? What tools are you designing? How many core failures do you expect as you run over, say, a multi-core system, and how does that impact your results? So we've really got these two takes on how to do inference from big data and what it means to extend it into these highly computational environments. Thinking about reconciling conflicting results, you end up with different results going back to stability, reliability, robustness of your results. How can you trace back those errors? And standing on the shoulders of giants. So if we have something where I have your software and then I'm able to see exactly how you've done this and carried out your investigations, I can extend your software. Maybe I can improve on your algorithm or try a new algorithm. But with the open software, I can really push on your work, and then it's, in a sense, an apples-to-apples comparison of exactly how much I've improved on your findings. Without getting into the software side of big data, it's very difficult to know, to sort of compare results. You don't even know sort of what baseline you're starting with. Okay, the third one, rethinking inference in scientific knowledge production. I know we're getting towards the end. I only have one slide. Okay, so this is, in a sense, my wish list for things to be thinking about. So standards for reproducibility in big data, so data access, software access. Those are easy words to say. It's not at all easy to do, particularly in big data situations. What format do you have data in? What form is your software in? What documentation goes with it? What about a lot of the big data holders are companies? How do you actually arrange with the company to have some sense of reproducibility in the data or open data? These are all questions I think as responsible scientists we need to take head on in our collaborations. Data generation versus data analysis. Do you understand big data? Most of the scientists haven't been responsible for collecting the data. In the traditional statistical setting, we would design the experiment, go and collect the data, or do the clinical trial, and we really understood the data generation process. Do we understand this now for big data? It's highly influential for what type of analysis we can do and how we can understand the results. And then, as I mentioned, this notion of robustness, producing stable results, and having an emphasis on reliability and reproducibility. Okay, some efforts. Okay, I'll just go through this really quickly. Really what I wanted to do was show you this slide. So this is an enormous amount of grassroots effort that's coming out of mostly the academic community. There's a few companies in here, but mostly these are academics who just realize these issues are important and are trying to solve it with some tools. So one that I've been working on is researchcompendia.org. I've also been working on Run My Code. But these are pretty much independent efforts. People don't really know what other folks are doing. They're coming from different fields and different disciplines, and people are trying to create solutions through tools to do things like capture parameter settings or capture what's important as you actually go through your experiment. So this is workflow tracking in research environments, so that when you get to the end of your experiment, you're ready to publish, it's not this huge effort to go ahead and share code and data. The first one, dissemination platforms, where do you actually put code and data so it's discoverable and linked up with the publication itself? And then there's a lot of innovation happening around embedded publishing, sort of a hybrid of the above two, where you produce a paper that has code and data embedded in it or links out to it so that results can actually be replicated from within the paper. So there's lots of work that's been happening here. I think I stop at 2, is that right? Okay, so I think.
We have until 2:30.
Oh, I have until 2:30. Okay. Okay. So I'll clean up then. Okay, so I'll just talk about an effort in Research Compendia, then I'll just open it to questions, I think. Okay, so Research Compendia is a project that I've been working on, and the idea is building a website where it's a collection of web pages, and each web page is associated with a published paper. And what this web page does is allows you to grab code, grab data that will reproduce the results in that paper. So there's a stable place that links out to the paper, and sometimes the journal will actually link back to the Compendia page. So that's a point. We're still developing this. But you can find code and you can find data. So what we're trying to do is understand who shares, what's easy to share, what's difficult to share, sort of use this as a pilot research project, as well as implementing greater reproducibility, sort of like embedding reproducibility in our channels of communication. Okay. So here's what a compendium page looks like. So this is a paper from PLOS One, I think, and you can click on the title and it'll send you out to the journal page. And you can see these buttons here. You can download code, you can download data, and then the abstract isn't just taken from the paper, it's really a description of code or description of data from the authors itself, so it helps you run this. And when you click on code or click on data, you'll get this pop-up window with your suggested citation for it too. So trying to embed citation practices in how we use code and how we use data, just like if we lean on other articles in our research. Okay, and it's all open source, so this is continually developing, and we have our entire Research Compendia platform on GitHub, so you can sort of see what we're doing or make contributions or fix things or whatnot. And we think this is important because it's philosophically consistent if we're behind code sharing to also share our code. And also, we're hoping that people will grab it and make use of it in contexts where maybe we didn't imagine it, like a journal is welcome to go ahead and use it to support their publication practices. Okay, so these reproducibility issues, so this parallels the slide I had on tools, where many researchers are developing these tools as sort of side projects to help with reproducibility, often in ways where they're not aware of what's happening in other disciplines. So this is just a smattering of some of the things that I've seen happening around reproducibility. Probably needs to be updated even now. But reproducibility coming up in high-performance computing is XSEED, like I mentioned. You can see mathematics, open science framework is issues around reproducibility in psychology. Geosciences, bioinformatics, AAAS, computer science, law, well, okay, so the law one I did, so it's a little bit cheating, but there's interest in this from folks in the law community, and then also in policy. So I'm happy to talk about, for example, in questions, what are funding agencies doing around issues of reproducibility. This is something that is now on the forefront of a lot of their discussions about how to support research. Okay, so there's some references for some of the stuff that I talked about in the talk, and I would love to open it to questions at this point.
This is less on reproducibility than the third and fourth ways of science. You brought up Google flu trends a couple of times. This is being taped, so I'll say this as without all the proper names. I think the remarkable thing about Google flu trends isn't that it failed, is that people believed ever that it would work for any period of time. People in the search community thought that was crazy. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take search terms, I'm going to try to predict the CDC flu counts, I'm going to do it in a linear additive model with almost no covariates.
Right.
And I keep adjusting and tweaking that model for a while until I find a stable patch, and then I go publish it. And I think a lot of people's surprised, even in the search community, it went viral. No pun intended, it got a lot of media attention. The scientific community got really enamored. So I guess what I'd say with this big computing is like the lessons that are hard won in traditional science, people like sort of forget.
Yeah,
people say, I'm going to
absolutely.
give you a structural model that happens to be linear additive on human search, on human behavior on anything with like 3 covariates, right?
Yeah, that was part of what I was, part of those points, the threads I was trying to weave together, talking about the statistical errors and also how does that relate in big science, because right now that's exactly what underlies some of this.
Yeah, people forget. I mean, I think when you put up your slide on big data and you're pointed to like selection and omitted variables, saying, "Oh, now we have a lot of data. Now you don't have to worry about those as
Right.
much."
Right.
It is a thing one hears, and one hears it like at National Academy of Science panels, and you're just sitting there going,
Absolutely,
we're talking, if it's hormone replacement therapy, and does it have a good or bad effect on women? Doesn't matter. We used to do it just on a survey of nurses. So if you had the data on every woman who's ever taken it, doesn't it all help you with the selection problem, right? It's the people who take it are just different than
Yep.
who don't. So I don't know. It's just, I don't know. It's a comment in the weirdness. So on the reproducibility. So why aren't? And I think I've asked this question to you before. Why aren't the grant-making agencies having a stronger role? Is it just that they're dealing with such diverse fields, and whatever's going to be the standard of reproducibility has to vary by the substantive area, and they have a tough time with that?
Yeah,
or
it's a great question. So the answer to that, I don't know the definitive answer to that, but I can speculate on that. So the different funding agencies have different levels of advancement on this. Like you can see NIH has a reasonable it's got its head around data. Right, like it tries to support data access, it has requirements around this. NSF is just starting to think about this, and my take on it is, well, they've had the data management plan since January 2011, but that's about all that we've seen, right? And my take on this is that the funding agencies, they don't want to build some structure that's totally useless to the community, which would be pretty easy if you just like if you and I got together, over a drink and hammered out something, and then, NSF kind of built it, it's not clear at all that it would match people's needs, right? Maybe it would match our needs or whatnot, but there really needs to be a very tight knit between what the community wants and is able to use and what the funding agencies are able to support, aside from the fact that that could be really expensive, and so that's sort of terrifying for them too. And so this fear of getting ahead of the research community, they really also almost want to lag so that they're pushed by the research community. So I think this is a lot of it. And then now it's been, in a sense, slowed down for the last couple of years by these mandates and so on from OSTP that are now in review and so on. So what I'm talking about, in 2013, Obama said in February that federal funding agencies had 6 months to remit their plan about data access and about access to papers. And they left out code because of Bayh-Dole, because code is now something that universities can patent, so that doesn't get in the mix. So already we've got this kind of bifurcation away from reproducibility. So those plans were submitted by August 22nd, and they're still under review and so on. So they're waiting to see, maybe, it could be very soon that we get some kind of comprehensive plan around at least support for data.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My background is in sociology, where I think reproducibility is generally not very high on the agenda. But I think there's maybe some legitimate concerns that a lot of us work with data on vulnerable populations, very, very personal data. And you might have the same in public health or medicine, right? So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on how concerns about privacy intersect with, those quests for transparency.
That's one of my favorite questions, so thank you for asking. So everything that I was talking about was assuming that your data is legally shareable. And there are certainly laws that control what you can do with, say, human subjects, and you can't just throw this stuff out. And so this all defers to any of those things. But however, I think we do have this system in place through the institutional review boards that's very, very protective of patients, and rightly so. We don't have a terrific history before this came in of the way we treated some folks. But now this is kind of the institutionalized institutional review board. This mindset is kind of institutional. And so we're actually getting situations now where people, they know a lot about data sharing. They would like to actually share their data with other researchers or have it shared more widely. And there's no real vehicle to do this. Once you have this, even if it was legal, like you weren't in a HIPAA violation or whatnot, you have this kind of, if there's privacy or confidentiality issues, it just gets locked down. That's it, no sharing. And so what I'd like to push people on is maybe it's not a black and white, that there's actually a gray continuum here. And there are places where maybe being respectful of people's agency around their own data, or being able to share with, say, a select group of other researchers, not wide open, that allows some reproducibility to happen. So I think there's kind of steps, if we think creatively about it, to bring in some of the benefits of reproducibility, but still protect people who are involved in studies and so on. It's just we're so locked down against it now that that's all new. And even these issues of what does informed consent mean in a big data context where new data is coming online all the time that increases the risk of re-identification and so on. So it's not a trivial issue, but I think it's something that there was a lot of thinking, very creative thinking, that we could do to improve both the science and respect for people's wishes around their data.
Can I ask a brief follow-up question?
Of course.
Could you just get a little bit more specific, right? Because like that's exactly it, right? When we're dealing with the IRB boards, right?
Yeah.
It's precisely that you have to make a case
Yep.
for basically lack of transparency to
Right.
be able, to work with the
Right.
data you want to work
And
with.
this, in my experience, is highly varied by institution. Some IRB boards are more open to this, some are just not open, and that's just the way it works at a particular institution. One of the solutions, I think there was a National Academies report, I don't know if it's out yet or whether it's just about to come out, revisiting the common rule, for example. And I think this type of thing where you sort of have something like a National Academies report or some consortium of people really kind of pushing thinking that's the way to go. I have seen, so I'll try and be really specific. I have seen some efforts, like for example, Brian Wandel, a professor of psychology at Stanford, has a lab where he has an MRI machine, and he stores all the scans that come off this. So he has like an elaborate data structure and has all the metadata and parameter settings on the machine and so on, and uses reproducible methods, at least some of the postdocs and so on, and researchers in there. But of course, you can't share that. These are patients, right? So this is be something that would be terrific to just open up the doors on if you could, because you've got all this kind of potential for reproducibility. So one thing that is a possibility that we just chatted about is he works in collaboration with sort of four or five other research groups that are around, that are sort of in that space in California. And so maybe there's a way to do a secure kind of sharing of data where things are through IRB, things are authorized, but you could have some independent replication just across, say, these five groups, and that would help the science, right? And if you could do this through IRB and legally, then you could also respect the confidentiality and privacy rights. So things like that that are just solutions that are just sort of step into that gray area rather than just seeing it as a black and white issue.
There's this lovely article last month in Science on the Google Blue Trends.
Yeah, that I mentioned, yeah. Yep. Yep.
One of the things that they mention is that Google never even disclosed what the search terms were.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and or the methods.
Or
either.
the methods.
Right.
Well, even if they have secret sauce in coming up with the terms, if you present the terms, people could check prospectively whether they continue to work or not, which kind of wasn't made available.
Yep.
But one of the really spooky things about this is that apparently in February 2012, Google started recommending sort of diagnoses and
Right.
treatments to go along with the flu when people search for certain things. So this is kind of really getting out there. I think if I recall correctly that I heard Hal Varian talk about this at the first Data Edge conference a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay.
And the excitement somehow was, I think, much more about the fact that it might be possible rather than that it's actually working.
Yeah.
But it's utterly bizarre. The other thing I wanted to comment on was those statistical terms that you were using around. One was maybe sensitivity and the other robustness.
Yeah.
And I guess I find them troubling in and of them, by themselves, because I can have a wonderfully insensitive and robust estimate by just returning the number 17 no matter what the input data are, right?
Right. Right.
So
sort of like this is also test and train kind of stuff, and can you predict and so on. And you're reminding me, so Philip and I were at a conference, I guess, last week, trying to use ideas from sort of simulation and big computation. They have sort of a very structured way of thinking about uncertainty quantification, validation, verification. They have specific meanings in that context that are a little different than what we've been talking about. And right away you start getting into, well, what exactly does this term mean in this context, and when does it apply, and when is it useful? And there's a lot of taxonomy, I think, in sort of getting those ideas across. And sort of robustness, all those words came up as, so here it's really designed to start people thinking about this rather than give the definitive answer, because especially when you talk across different fields, we're immediately going to be in these taxonomy problems, but yeah.
I just have a follow-up question on stability and robustness.
Yeah.
So I'm working on a project where there's the data is pretty noisy, and my results actually change pretty drastically every time I use slightly different set of
Or
data.
if you update the data set slightly.
Yeah. So I just want to understand if there's some kind of a generally well-accepted measure of robustness or stability out there somewhere that I could take a look at.
It's a work in progress. These are brand new. So BIN just published on this last year, and I think this is really, I think it's really important because of exactly questions like this. So what's the metric for stability in methods that you're using, and how do you source this out and separate this from instability coming from just data? Your data is noisy, or you're just sort of updating it and it changes. And so this is a brand new area, so I don't have a good paper so that you can quantify this, but I think this would be a very exciting place to do some work.
Generically, it's a bias variance trade-off, right?
It applies which trade-off?
Generically, it's a bias variance trade-off. Somehow you can impose stability at the risk of introducing uncertainty of a different kind.
Yeah, and this stuff too, I mean, it's not clear that that's necessarily a big data issue, like sort of noisy, problematic data, not problematic, but that gives you different estimates, that's an old problem that we've had. I mean, we have robust statistics for a long time because of this problem.
The instability in the computational algorithms themselves, that's partly new. It's like these aren't closed-formed estimators, et cetera, and the standards for writing those computing algorithms are
and so that's
not
where
good.
you get that intersection of computer science with statistics and how they can start informing each other on this.
Even for least squares, it was like at least a decade and a half of work and longer of doing that matrix inversion well.
The QR decomposition.
Yeah, exactly, and exactly how you do that. And there became standards, there was test beds, and even I think 20 years ago, if you sent near singular versions of it to 10 different physical software packages, they wouldn't all agree. But if you use some standard libraries, they do, and then you get, you'd be able to use the BLAS libraries at work. But that took a major effort.
So you're making an argument for open source, so we can really inspect what's going on in the code, and an argument for common platforms.
Yeah, and the thing that you said the most scared me is that the grant agencies don't want to get ahead of the research community. I mean, the history of randomized trials in medicine is some people took over the regulator and forced it through. What would have happened in a world that you didn't capture the regulator? I'm not sure you would have gotten standards for randomized trials.
This is happening, and they're being spurned by that Obama executive order around open data from a little more than a year ago, and they're actually starting to take this on. So I think we'll see something. But other than that, I don't know. I mean, you could ask the same question, like, why don't sort of more senior researchers take on some of these problems? And I think it just takes time to kind of percolate in. But I'm not making excuses. That's just the way I see it.
Maybe you can take this as kind of a follow-up question.
Okay.
But with respect to, say, the scholarly ecosystem, how does reproducibility figure in there? At the one extreme, there's sort of a reputation-destroying thumbs up or thumbs down, as gets to the newspapers. Right. Maybe more nuanced is model extension.
Yep.
I mean, does anybody can really get tenure from knocking down?
Yes, I'm sure this has happened. So I'm not thinking of an example, but sort of the young upstart that really turns over the accepted canon and then sort of gets a lot of recognition for this.
30 years later.
Maybe 30 years later. Okay, so it's not consistent, but there are at least in theory that's supposed to go. I can think of a couple of examples, but this is, I think also you're bringing up this notion of the collective action problem. So that's why I'm not in favor of Obama stepping in and telling us about open data and so on. On the other hand, I think one of the things that you're alluding to is it takes some time and effort to do reproducible research. If it's not rewarded, and you're better off being on your next paper, like whatever is rewarded, right? And so something that can kind of push the community as a whole, like what you were saying about funding agencies taking that role and kind of stepping us, I think that has to happen. We sort of have to. It's not something that's just going to be organic. Yeah, Philip. Oh, I've got one actually.
So if you have a follow-up.
Well, just I wish that I had said this while Henry was in the room. It's following the same thing. But a corollary of the snippet that you paraphrased from Donahoe is that in promotion and tenure cases, we should be looking at people's work and saying, how nice that you advertised your results in Science and Nature and the New England Journal of Positive Results and whatever else. And it's like, where's the actual work? Is anybody using it?
Yep.
But so the academy needs something about that, but we need deans and whatnot.
This is why I'm so excited about, so a small part of it is citation, and one thing we're trying to do with Research Compendia is get that citation in there so people can use your software and so on, but it's something that people can measure, right? That you've actually had that downstream impact. It doesn't sort of get buried in their paper, and I think things would change radically if we somehow could snap our fingers and all data you're using, all software you're using would get cited, and you'd get sort of respect for those citations. I think people would be much happier putting data in code. I think some of the worry is, I have some research on this I couldn't go into, but some of the worry is, I put data code out there, I've done all this work, people are going to get easy papers, and I don't get anything for it, so why should I? Which is terrible, yeah.
Okay, I have a question or maybe suggestion for your websites.
Great.
And I'm not sure if your website already does this or if another one does this, but one thing that I think would be really useful is for people who replicate to be able to comment and post their code. Because a lot of the time when I'm replicating a paper, I'll find that the results are really sensitive or they don't even come out right. And every time this happens, I don't have, I can't write a paper, write a research comment explaining this. But if there was a website where I could just, post a comment in the code, that would be really helpful.
You're exactly right. Okay, so we have this secret thing called, it's hard to see, but it's labs.researchcompendia.org. And so let's take a look, say this +1 here. So this Compendia page, there you go. No comments, but start the discussion and so on. So we're doing it in our labs, and we're going to roll that out to the rest of the site. So that's incredibly important. We are really excited about getting version control in there. So there's a couple of options that we haven't decided on what necessarily is the best way, but suppose you re-implement that algorithm or fix bugs. So bug fixes I think we can put on the same page, but a re-implementation, maybe it's a new Research Compendia page, so you get citation and credit when people are using your stuff, and they just kind of are linked together or nested in that way. But that's absolutely one of the goals. Like right now we have sort of it's a little bit bare bones. I should have mentioned we launched in November. And so we're playing around in labs, and we're exactly on the same page with everything you suggested. We're trying to get that going.
So did I hear correctly that if I update,
That if I update it,
yeah,
it's a different page that gets
I think that's a good idea. So suppose you have an algorithm. Let's take an actual algorithmic one here, like algorithm 837. Suppose you re-implement this. I would give you a page. It would be linked back to this one, but then people could go ahead and cite the use of your code.
But why can't, but say I wanted to change, I'm probably misunderstanding. If I want to tweak the algorithm a little, can't I go to just version 1.2? And then here's the change log?
Yeah. So one of the things that we thought about is having sort of a GitHub widget in there, so you can really kind of see this, because we don't need to reinvent all of that stuff that's already in GitHub. Yeah, it's on our to-do list. Yeah.
So if I get this straight, then I get this straight, sort of.
No.
So I can just take this to my editor, and this will be. I can take this to my editor, and it will be implemented without a great deal of hassle for any particular journal.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, that's
we're being filmed, so I have very early preliminary partner. I just put the renewal in
that's
for
fine.
this, but that's exactly what we're doing with a bunch of journals. Like for example, with the American Statistical Association, we'll be doing that with journals, and it's not necessarily in labs, although this stuff will be rolled out. But it's almost like costless to say to your authors, you know, there's this extra thing, and we can create compendium pages that will link back and forth. And then it starts, then the journal can at least signal this is important to us, even if they're not making it a requirement, first off.
Thanks very much. Fantastic talk.
Thank you so much.